Well, good afternoon, everyone. We're glad to have you here. This is sorry about the technology is a beautiful thing, isn't it? Um, but it's going to get better, I promise. But we're glad to have everyone here. This is the Future Economic Models track, workshop number 3. I hope that's where you're planning on being. We set this track because it just seems like a really important topic for the well-resourced congregations in the Episcopal Church to think in fresh and outside the box ways about how we're good stewards of those assets in the coming years, in the ways that we may not know yet and need to think creatively. So this is leveraging our assets to support current and future ministries. And I'm glad that you all are here. Nathan Kirkpatrick is the Managing Director of Alban at Duke Divinity School and a priest associate at the Church of the Advocate in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and is going to moderate this. So Nathan, we're glad you're here, and take it away.
Thanks, James. Well, welcome this afternoon to this conversation. For a while now at Alban at Duke Divinity School, we've been paying attention to trends and patterns within American congregational life. We've been looking at all sorts of the ways that congregations are changing. And one of the trends we've been watching is the way that congregations support and sustain their ministries. As pledge and plate giving has declined in many places, and as longtime benefactors and donors pass away, we regularly receive questions about congregational economics. Sometimes it sounds like, how do we make our budget? Or how do we develop alternative revenue streams? Or could we open a coffee shop in the nave or rent the parish hall to make ends meet? Or how much money can we really draw from our endowment? Now, those are all important questions. And they all point to a single reality that some of you may have heard David King from the Lake Institute on Faith and Giving say. The sky isn't falling, but the ground is shifting when it comes to congregational economics. A few years ago, though, I learned that there was a more interesting conversation happening around congregational economics and the life of faith, a conversation that interrogated my assumptions about economics and asked that I explore not just the revenue side of the equation, but the receiving, managing, and spending dimensions of our congregational economic life. This conversation makes the economic conversation much more interesting because it makes it as complex as it is. The person who introduced me to that conversation was Shannon Hopkins from Matrushka House, and she was supposed to be here with us today. Unfortunately, she is not able to be with us, but instead, in her place, she asked one of the foremost voices in that conversation to be with us. And I'm so glad that she did. Rosalie Harden is an Episcopal priest, an entrepreneur, a visionary, a prophet. She was the canon for money and meaning at the cathedral in Asheville, North Carolina. And yesterday, she had a chance to join two of her friends, two thought leaders from around the church, Eve Poole, who is in the Church of England, and Mark Elsden, who's a Presbyterian pastor in, I believe, Madison, Wisconsin, for a conversation about a different economic. We recorded that conversation and we'll share it with you during this time. But before we do, I want to look to Rosalie and see if there's anything she would tell us about that conversation before we see it.
Well, as you'll hear in the conversation, I got the great opportunity to have almost an hour to talk to two of my very favorite people who are doing amazing and leading work in this area of what it is that the church is up to and what can we be up to with a new economy. And so I hope you'll enjoy that conversation, and then we'll be here to point you to some other resources and to answer questions when it's over. Thanks for asking me, Nathan.
Course. So one of the things you'll hear echoes of Julia Whitworth's conversation with Darren Walker yesterday. You'll hear echoes of Sam Wells this morning. You'll hear echoes from other workshops in this conversation. And let me encourage you, stay through to the end, because there are tools about your own personal finance, your own sort of economic thinking, but also that may shape how you think about congregational economics. So hang in the conversation. It's well worth your time. If I can get the technology to work, here's the conversation.
Thank you, Nathan. I'm glad to be here with two amazing people who have shaped my mind and my thinking about money and meaning and faith and finance in my work over the last several years. One of them is Mark Elston. The story that I have to tell about Mark is that I've been producing SOCAP, which is this conference about impact investing, since 2008, and started hearing from Mark probably 3 or 4 years ago. And Mark would tell me that he wanted me to look at his work on impact investing. And I'm thinking, what does a Presbyterian pastor have to say about impact investing? And it was finally about 1.5 years ago when I went out. Mark and I were both speaking at the same conference, and he came to me and said, I'm going to be talking about impact investing this afternoon, so I really want to get a feedback on your talk. And I would tell you, Mark, I was absolutely blown away. Your work around impact investing, the way you talk about it, that is so accessible, the way you make it so relevant for the church, the way you make it easy to understand. You don't have to be a banker, you don't have to be an investor, you don't have to be a pastor. It's just a compelling story about the work that you've done at Pres House. We're going to come back to you in a little bit, but then I'm going to tell everybody about my other hero, who I'm so lucky to be here talking to, and that's Eve Poole. I told her the first time I met her that, oh man, I wish I were 30 years later and younger and could be her. The idea that she has a PhD in economics and theology is so exciting, and the work she's done with that and the place she comes from with that is so spectacular. Your book, Buying God, which has become a favorite that I am recommending, and we'll be talking about it in Mark's book more in a minute, but Buying God has been such an influence on so many people in terms of talking about their personal finances and how that lines up with what God would have us do. But I want to talk for a minute first about your work in the Church of England. Could you tell us a little bit about what being the third commissioner, tell us you're the third
church estates commissioner.
I never get it. Yes.
It's from some ancient piece of 1880s legislation, so it's quite a mouthful. There are 3 estates commissioners. The first one chairs the Assets Committee, the second one answers questions in Parliament, and the third one, me, has the portfolio for bishops and cathedrals. But we all sit on the board, and as some of you will know, the Church Commissioners for England have a really big ethically invested portfolio, which is about £9 billion. And that's a mixture of investments and land and forestry and commercial property of various kinds. So I'm involved in that side of it as well.
So in a call that you and I were on a couple of months ago dealing with the pandemic, and you were talking about what was happening in cathedrals and what was happening in what we would call missions, or the small congregations that you tend to have more interaction with, that the cathedrals and the missions, if I've got that right, that don't have a vibrant ongoing ministries and finances, and you're having to make decisions about those. And my first question to you, Eve, comes out of that place that we all have kind of watched what's happened with religion in Europe and in the UK here from the US, and have seen the decline there, the decline in the use of properties and the decline in finances. And I'm wondering if you could just pretend you're our prophet from the future and tell us what you see happening there now and what you would advise us to do about investments and property and the things that we are so worried about right now in the future of the church.
Well, I think first of all, it's sort of going back as well as forward, because the Episcopal Church in America has always been sort of member funded, if I can put it like that. Mm-hmm. And obviously in certain bits of your country, you have some quite big investments in your own right and generous benefaction. But you don't have the hundreds of years of endowment funding that the Church of England has. So until about 20 or 30 years ago, the Church of England was pretty much wholly subsidized by the church commissioners. And so nobody had to have any relationship with money if you weren't, in the center running the place. So people would put their nickels and dimes in the plate, feel really virtuous with absolutely no idea whether that would even pay for the communion wine. So in some ways, the Episcopal Church in America is way ahead, because you have always had to be a bit more realistic about how mission and ministry is actually funded, whereas we've been on a really steep learning curve in Britain. And that has given us some really funny behaviors, because to begin with, it was all about which churchmanship was doing tithing, and therefore they could call all the shots around what should be happening and what the priorities for ministry and mission should be. There's been a huge fever around stewardship and trying to get giving up. But I think we sort of, having caught up so quickly, so late, we've got to the end of that quite quickly too, which is that's not really the point. It's not just about trying to scrape together enough money to pay for a vicar. That's really not what mission is, and it's not what the Church of England is. So I think coming out the end of that, we're starting to realise that it's actually about trying to listen very hard to God about what God might be wanting us to do, given this extraordinary footprint we have. Because as you know, the parochial system in England means that there is not a square of the country that isn't part of a parish. And it doesn't matter whether you have any faith or none, you have rights to come and be baptised and buried, married, whatever in your parish church. So it's a very particular footprint, really. It's better than the post office and Tesco and places like that. We've got a lot of outlets, and those outlets are quite expensive if all you're doing is trying to tempt a few people who like morning prayer or like a particular scheme of worship and will pay for that. So I think what's been great about the pandemic is it's kind of given us a bit of a shot in the arm about what these buildings are really for, because it's made us all get furiously local very quickly. And just as a matter of national security, if you're trying to roll out a track and trace program, food banks, if you're trying to roll out vaccination, then actually having the kind of footprint we've got means we've got a toehold in every single community in Britain. Where services are closed down, the libraries aren't there, the post offices aren't there, the pubs are closed, the schools closed. There's nothing left except the church. And actually, if the church closes, there will be no shared public space in very many communities in rural areas of Britain. So we're in the process of trying to really listen to what that might mean. In the 60s, in the Diocese of Sheffield, when they wanted to get into industrial mission, as it was then called, it was driven by a real worry that the Church of England had got so irredeemably middle class, they couldn't hear God anymore. And they thought, if we go to the shipyards and the steelworks, we might be able to hear what God is saying to the people there, because it's not like God stopped speaking or God only speaks to the baptized. And I think that's what we're learning at the moment. I feel that we're stopping being this frenzy of sort of being a member-led church that has to sort of service its membership in order to deserve funds. It's trying to think, well, that's not really the point. The point is the gospel. And actually, if we go and listen to what God is saying to everybody that God has made with a purpose, then they'll probably tell us what we need to do next. So that feels very exciting. And there's lots of innovations springing up. The cathedrals are full to the gunnels. They will be again once people are allowed back in. And they attract everybody because people aren't scared. They feel the building is theirs, so they come in. Whereas I think for some of the parish churches, they've been sort of locked, they've been closed, and people don't know if they're allowed in. So we're learning a lot from ourselves at the moment, which feels really exciting.
That does sound exciting. As you were talking, it brought to mind a great news story that I saw making the rounds over here, where one of the cathedrals was a vaccination site, and the organist decided to play organ recitals for the people in line for vaccines. And that just was such a wonderful way to blend what the church has in terms of space and graciousness as people come in for emergency needs too. So
yeah, it was the organist in Salisbury, and there was a very funny story about him playing beside the seaside as somebody came in to get, and it was lovely. There were lots of people requesting favorite songs from their childhood, as well as favorite hymns and Handel's Messiah and all of that. And there will be 4 cathedrals who are being vaccination centres, and some more that are being testing centres, and that's been really exciting, that fusion, because they are such big, wonderful public spaces. It's very easy to do a really good public health program like that. So again, hopefully there'll be more opportunities. There's some other cathedrals that are being used as what they call Nightingale courts. They've been creating all these big extra hospitals called Nightingale hospitals to cope with COVID. And the courts, of course, the juries can't sit in such close proximity. So Peterborough Cathedral is being used as a court because, again, it's really nice and big. So there's lots of opportunity, which is really exciting for re-engaging with ordinary people who we should be talking to anyway.
Well, those are great. Those are great stories. We're going to come back to you in a few minutes to talk more specifically about your book, Buying God. But I want to switch to Mark right now and ask Mark if you could kind of give us an overview of where you come at this question about faith and money and meaning and finance from your position as a Presbyterian minister at the University of Wisconsin, in one of the most beautiful cities in the United States, Madison, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Rosalie, and great to be with you, Eve. I'm actually going to pick it up where Eve left it, because the stories about the way that church is trying to engage its neighborhood and its parish, broadly speaking, are so interesting. So I'm a pastor, executive director at Press House, which is a Presbyterian campus ministry center at the University of Wisconsin and in Madison here. And we went through a similar process of almost 20 years ago of trying to evaluate what we were going to be. So our campus ministry is more than 100 years old, but had gone into sort of a phase of pretty severe decline. And my wife, who serves with me as pastor, and I were called there in 2004. We came into a situation that had 0 students involved, a building falling apart, a real financial kind of crisis. And so there was an opportunity to reevaluate, as Eve was describing, like, what do we do? What are we doing in the center of this huge research institution, this one of the premier universities in the world, actually? What are we doing with this space? What does this mean to be a student community there? And so we did re-engage and restart a worship experience, a worship service, which is what I was trained to do and what my wife was trained to do. And we love our worship element, and we have church for students every Sunday. It's obviously different this year than any other year. But one of the things that changed dramatically was not only do we worship on Sunday, we also now serve students through a student apartment community. So I'm going to just share my screen while I tell you this. It's just a 1-minute video, but it gives a better sense of what this place is. So this is the Press House Apartments, and this is a 240-bed student apartment building that we built on the parking lot next to this historic church building that you can see here that's been Press House for many decades. It's right in the center of the University of Wisconsin campus, literally in the heart of the Central Mall. And we serve students in such a different way with this residential component to what we do. So worship is fantastic. We love our worship life, but students living with us are able to be reached and served in ways that you just can't do with a 1-hour worship service. So one example is we have a program for students who are in recovery, addiction recovery. So alcohol addiction, many heroin addiction, and they live together in a sober housing unit in our apartment building. And we're able to provide them with really in-depth services and support. Some of these students, while most of these students would not make it through university without this supportive living community. We've actually been able to measure that we've saved the state of Wisconsin, more than $500,000 in costs associated with relapse as a result of this program. But what's so exciting to me is that we are seeing a need on our campus for sober housing and meeting that need as the church. And that is what the church is doing, right? In addition to worship, in addition to Bible studies, we are providing this housing that's just nobody else is providing on our campus. And that's really an exciting thing for us to be rooted in what's going on in our neighborhood and serving that need. as a side note, for those interested in this question of money, this project for us has dramatically changed our financial situation as an organization as well. We increased our budget 1,500% as a result of this development, and we now have a much larger set of resources to work with, and we have turned what was a very underutilized property into a very valuable property, both kind of just on the books valuable, but also annual revenue valuable, and then more importantly, mission valuable, and really serving the needs of the student body.
The work you're doing there just blows my mind, and the way that communities have developed, and the story in your book. I don't know that we've mentioned the title of it yet, but We Aren't Broke, coming out from Erdman's in June the 1st. The stories you tell there about the first student showing up and saying, "What's going on here?" And you're saying, "Well, nothing's going on here, but come join us and let's see what we can do," is an amazing story. So Mark, can you go on and talk about the impact investment that your presbytery made and how that came about, and how you actually got the apartments launched?
Sure, yeah. So when we originally did this project, we actually did financed it mostly through fairly traditional commercial financing. I'll skip all of the details of kind of the ins and outs of it, but basically a commercial financing arrangement with a local or a regional bank and tax exempt bonds and so on and so forth. But what happened was we built this project in 2007, and you'll recall what happened in 2008 to the global market, to economic reality changed dramatically. And so when we came to refinance, which is typical for a project like this, about 5 years out from our original construction, we found that we actually were short some cash, basically. Not because the project wasn't working, it was working fine financially, but the paper value had declined because the way banks were valuing property changed as a result of the 2008 financial crisis. And then also the loan to value ratios banks were willing to lend at changed, and so on and so forth. So the bottom line was we were short about $2.5 million, which is not nothing for an organization like us, in terms of our financing. And that led me to basically, well, mostly lots of sleepless nights at first, and then into a year-long process of working with one of our denominational partners, the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, which is a regional body of the Presbyterian Church, to seek an investment from them to support this project. And they ended up after lots of conversation, reviewing financials, and really mostly talking about the mission, they ended up taking a quarter of their $10 million endowment and shifting it out of stock and bond investments and other traditional investments and moving it into real estate, into Presbyterian-owned real estate and our real estate, essentially. So they made an investment. It ended up being in the form of a loan, although any number of possible structures could have been set up. But they made what is an impact investment, basically, in our project. That allowed us to secure financing, the rest of our financing, to go on with our mission, to continue to generate revenue. We've served thousands upon thousands of students since they did that. We then pay a return on that investment back to the Synod, and then they use the money we pay them to run their programs. So we use their money to run our programs, we generate revenue off of it, and then we pay them to run their programs with some of the proceeds. So it's really a win-win across the board for everyone. That's what led me into ultimately exploring this idea of impact investing further, and then writing this book, We Aren't Broke, that is coming out shortly. Basically because we have a lot of resources in the church. We aren't actually broke. We have millions, billions actually, of dollars across the globe, owned by religious organizations, both in investment assets and then property assets. And there's ways in which we can use some of those capital assets differently than we have been, frankly, in order to fulfill the mission that we have before us. in order to do God's work in different and creative ways. I sometimes ask myself, so currently we're financed still as a mixture of commercial financing and then this other denominational investment, but I still ask myself sometimes, why are we financed by banks at all? There's billions of dollars there. Why are projects like this not financed within the church all the time? And obviously I unpack some of those questions in my book, why. There's lots of reasons maybe why, but there's a lot of potential to do things differently than we have been, and to basically generate new expressions of the church while also generating revenue in sustainable ways.
That why aren't we doing this all the time? Why isn't the church's money being used in this way all the time? It's such a huge question. And one of the there's a sentence in Eve's book that just grabs me all the time, and it's I'm usually talking about her in the third person. She's actually right here, talking about how the church is really caught up in this spiral of consumerism, which I would also say is just a spiral of deferring to the economy, of the way that the economy tells us things are supposed to be. That we when I talk to pastors a lot of the time about preaching about money, sometimes I ask the question, are your parishioners more informed about how they spend their money from the PBS or NPR's business hour, or are they more informed by the gospel about how we spend money? And the answer is absolutely. They are more informed by the culture and by what the business community tells us that money is for than we are. And she says, you say the core message is that Christianity is incredibly well placed to rescue humanity from a negative spiral of consumerism, which I would say also a negative spiral of believing the economic myths around us. The church needs to get a lot better at saying so, showing the way and being heard. So how are some of the ways that we need to show the way about doing more projects like Mark is talking about with Prez House, and investing our own money in God's economy rather than the world's economy, and about our own personal finances, which is what your book is particularly about, personal finance. But I'm just curious, and this is really for both of you, but starting with Eve, how can we get better at evaluating these questions and knowing our place as the people of God in the economy?
Well, I think Mark's is a brilliant case study of exactly how you would do this in one particular area. And I think for me, it all started when I tried to wrestle with the fact that I had a theology degree, I had an MBA, I'd worked in the city for Deloitte, I'd worked for the Church of England, and I really wanted to bang heads together because people weren't talking to each other. It was like they were kind of hermetically sealed worlds that should never correspond, God versus mammon. And I just got so cross because, particularly being a girl and a theologian, how dare you even talk about economics? It's very cheeky. You should leave that to the grown-ups. And I thought, well, what is it then? Why won't people explain it? It's a bit like when you phone up an IT help desk and they give you jargon. I was just not happy about that. And I think the more I fought with all the textbooks and all the economists, I developed an incredibly straightforward, very basic understanding of markets, which is all about messages of supply and demand. And I can understand that. I get that, if there's a huge, furious rush for $1 million handbags, there'll be a load of people who make $1 million handbags. Whereas if there's a huge, furious rush for generic diabetic drugs or, heaven forfend, a COVID vaccine that everybody could access, there will suddenly be, supply. So thinking about supply and demand got me into thinking about our transactions as votes. And you can look at that in terms of the commissioner's portfolio. Recently, because they're a really sizable ethical investment fund in the UK, they teamed up with some American pension funds and some other funds around the world to launch something called the Transition Pathways Initiative, which is about forcing the oil and gas majors onto a track towards the Paris Agreement and making them cross various thresholds every year or so towards those goals, and threatening to divest if they don't. And that has created a huge global head of steam, which is making them all come to heel. You'll have read a lot about Exxon. There's a huge load of engagement going on there at the moment because they're being particularly recalcitrant. But we've got Shell to declare a whole lot of strategic stuff they would never have disclosed earlier. So there's a lot of David and Goliath around just being really, really clear about how messages of supply and demand work and what it means to have a share and what rights that gives you. So that helps when you have an investment portfolio. But what does that also mean if you're just thinking about your transactions as votes? So having written the big sort of macroeconomic book, Toxic Assumptions, I wanted to write something that was more practical about, well, what are we up to when we're thinking about supply and demand, and what kind of beast is consumerism such that religion has anything to say about it rather than just worrying that it's of the devil. And that took me into some beautiful theology about yearning. And all that stuff Augustine says about our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. And consumerism isn't bad, it's just gone the wrong way. It's like a tractor beam. You know, all the technologies of consumerism have taken away this yearning we have towards trying to be whole, and have subverted that into imagining that we just need to buy a few glossy baubles and that will kind of plug the gap. And Rowan Williams writes beautifully on this. He says, well, look, we're never going to be perfect. That's not our design. We're going to be perfect when we get to God, when we have become God, whatever your theology of that is. So actually, we've got to just stop deluding ourselves to think that the next shiny thing would ever complete us, and to start thinking properly about where our yearning should go. And for me, that is all about salt and light. It's about the kingdom. It's about trying to put all our votes into God's hands. And so for me, it's basic things like looking at your bank statement and trying to red, amber, green it. You know, which transactions are just lazy, cheap transactions that cost someone else a lot of money further down the supply chain in terms of indentured labor and modern slavery, poor work practices, dreadful, you know, externalities in terms of the effect on the environment and elsewhere. And it's trying to be really, really clear-sighted about what you are paying for and what else are people paying for in order for you to have access to something cheap. And what does that mean for you and your conscience? And as soon as you start looking at it like that, you start getting really interested in how you are paid for what labor, and are you happy about that? Where do you get your money from in terms of where is your pension invested? Where are your investments invested? If you get any income from those kinds of sources. Where are you spending your bills in terms of, you know, ethical providers of, you know, your utilities and your phone? Where are you shopping to get your food? Where are you shopping for your books? Because the thing is that actually, given particularly what Mark said about the sheer volume of people of faith in the world who really get this once you talk to them, if we all mobilise, we could do a lot more than just creating a few fair trade categories in the market. We could absolutely transform the market overnight. And it's just trying to have the courage to just decide to do that, because we would all need to get on with it. But there doesn't need to be that many of us to get on with it for the wheel to start turning. So that's really my big thing, is if we can all just start developing a guilty conscience about our bank statements. It only takes a few months to turn those reds to ambers and the ambers to green. And then, you know, we're already halfway there.
Well, why don't you walk us through the bank statement, or as I call it, my American Express bill, and how you use the red, green, and amber, and the process you show us in your book.
Okay, so it's part of and again, we'll make these resources available to you. It's part of a sort of general consumption audit. I'm not sure you can see this, which looks at all the ways we consume assets. So we are consuming money, but we're also consuming our time, which is finite. So are we using that really beautifully and wisely? We're consuming our talents, our God-given talents. Are we squandering those? Are we developing them? Are we being generous about them? We are also consuming our relationships with other people. And are we actually paying into that, or are we using other people overly and as means, as ends rather than means? Vice versa. And we're using up the planet. We're using valuable natural resources too. So there's a bit at the end of the book that takes you through a sort of consumption audit, which gets you to try and look very carefully across all of your consumptive activity to try and optimize all of it. But the bank statement thing is so wonderfully easy. It doesn't matter what kind of statement it is you've got, but it's a thought experiment about showing up to the pearly gates in St. Peter, putting his spectacles on and asking you exam questions about, you know, your life as an economic citizen. And if he was really trying to get to the bottom of that, he'd get you to show the bank statement, because that shows where you've been. It shows what you've spent on what. It shows there your treasure be, there your heart be also. So actually you can't hide from it. There's an awful lot else that you do, I'm sure, with your money, but this is a really interesting report card, just as a snapshot. So what I tend to do is I go through with my marker pen on one hand and Google on the other, and I check out these corporations. You know, are they signed up to the Ethical Trading Initiative? What's happening in their supply chain? Do they pay corporate tax? I do all those kinds of things. There are lots of websites now that will help you with that. There's consumer.org in Britain, but there's lots, I'm sure, in America too, where they will score companies for you around their ethical practices and how well they're behaving. There's a general rule of thumb that the New Economics Foundation in the UK came up with about local spending, which is really interesting, which I actually first learned about when I was in Cape Cod, and I went into a church there, and they had an initiative. They had a little form in the pews that you had to take away, and it was their $50 project. And they said, well, we want you to think of 3 local businesses, you know, it might be a hairdresser or a florist or a fish shop or a baker, that you really rate, you really want them to always be there. And instead of just going past and going, oh, how lovely, and then going to the superstore, why don't you actually go in and spend $50 every month? Because then if you do that, they will stay in business. And so it's that sort of thinking about how can you vote your cash locally to keep it local. So the New Economics Foundation found that if you take your dollar and you take it into like a big chain store, the dollar is worth about, let me get this right, 36 cents, because most of the money from that transaction goes off to headquarters, it goes off to offshore, whatever else. So it kind of stops, the money doesn't really go anywhere. But if you were to go into your local baker or your local hairdresser or a coffee shop, that dollar becomes worth $1.76 because it ends up circulating. And again, I'll put a link in for a really beautiful video they made in the Shetland Islands in Scotland about a wee boy during COVID who was really thinking about this, about what happens to your money when you take it to one shop and then they take it to another shop and spend it there, and then that gets, you know, it's about trying to keep that money circulating. So one of the best ways to rig your statement is to try and keep your shopping as local as you can. And that's not to say that all scalable businesses are bad, it's just to say try and balance that. And things like Amazon, you know, we're all having to use an awful lot of online delivery services during the pandemic, but it's trying to figure out, given Amazon's practices around, certainly in the UK, wages and tax and things like that, there are better alternatives that again would support the local community. And so it's trying to, you know, get that mentality that it might be slightly awkward and slightly annoying. It's a bit like sort of walking to the local shop and walking to 5 local shops instead of just going to the supermarket and getting it all there. But actually you are investing in the kind of community you want always to have around you. So my red, amber, green is stuff like that. So green is transactions you feel really proud about, that you would be dancing towards St. Peter going, go me, I paid in cash because I know that means they don't have to have transaction costs, and I paid in this local shop. And then the red ones are kind of like, oh, I was just really busy and I'd forgotten to buy her a present and I just went online and clicked there and it was really cheap. And you know yourself, you know that's really, really bad economic behavior. And then the ambers are ones where, well, it's eBay, so of course that's facilitating local traders, but is eBay really pulling their weight in terms of corporate tax and what they do? And it's just a way to prick your conscience and just keep you really getting interested in which companies are standing up, behaving well, which ones are blaming it on supply chain and outsourcing it to third parties. And, you know, are you feeling chipper about where you're voting your cash?
I love it and hate it at the same time, because you showed your bank statement and it was awfully green. Mine stays pretty mixed. I'll say that. It's such a hard thing to do, but I love your quoting Rowan Williams that, you know, it's not perfection. We can't do it perfectly. That's not what this world is about. But a story that I have from a time when I was canon for money and meaning at the cathedral here in Asheville, where with Amazon and a local bookshop, and the local bookseller was a member of the cathedral, and his shop was always at every book signing. Every time we had an author come speak, he would be there. He would order the books. He would come. He would sell them, and with all of the things going on with independent bookstores, he started having trouble. And it was a difficult decision for the clergy at the cathedral, but one of them just stepped up and did it and started sending out emails saying, we need to support he's a member of our congregation. Can we all just make an agreement this Christmas that we're gonna, any book we buy for anybody this Christmas, we will buy through the local bookshop. And it kept him alive for another, he was approaching retirement, but he made it to retirement because people stepped up and said, no, we're going to take another step. We're going to drive a mile rather than click to buy a book for this holiday. And it was huge what one congregation could do for one store. So shifting now to shifting now to the more institutional side of it. Mark, could you talk to us a little bit about a tool that you've been working with at Rooted Good, and I know makes an appearance in your book, that I think we're kind of colloquially calling the 9 square, but it's the centerpiece of y'all's work around how to figure out whether you're looking at your money or your mission as an institution. I think you could also use it personally, but it's really, I think, designed to be used by organizations, right?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. Let me share my screen again here, if that's okay. Actually, I'm going to start by just saying briefly a word about a program so in addition to my work at Press House, I'm also a co-founder of Rooted Good, which is an organization that exists to support other social impact organizations doing their work. We provide tools and processes for churches, nonprofits, social businesses to do their work better. And one of the things that we are currently doing is enrolling, accepting applications and enrolling congregations in our Oikos Accelerator, it's really a sort of small business accelerator for churches to think about how to use their property in different ways. But one of the tools that we will help churches with is this one that Rosalie just mentioned. And it is, we call it the money and mission alignment tool, or this 9-box tool. And we can share this also because it's maybe hard to see on the screen. But basically it's a 9-box grid turned on its axis to be kind of a diamond. And it's really just about aligning this money and mission. It can be used personally, but we've been using it mostly for organizations to think about. And you can use it to think about your program activities, your revenue activities, and your investing. All of it can kind of be plotted here. And so I'll just talk through it really briefly. Over on the far left side, there is this box 1, which are activities that an organization just does because it's just core to who they are and their heart, close to their heart, even if it costs them money, right? So for us at Press House, holding worship for students on Sunday, it's part of who we are. It's part of who we've been for more than 100 years. But I can guarantee you that as generous as some of our students are, they're not putting enough money in the offering box to pay for our Sunday experience. That's not the intent. That's not how we designed it. We don't plan for that to be the case. We subsidize, obviously, that activity with other forms of revenue. But these are things that we just do because they're really important to do. So we have to generate some revenue somewhere else in order to do those things. So over here in box 4, we have things that we would hope are either neutral or we'll see in a moment, positive, that generate revenue. For us at Press House, an example is we actually set aside a small empty closet space in our apartment building and lease that out to a cell phone company. And the cell phone company puts cell phone equipment in there. We are not in the business of providing 5 bars of cell phone service. It's not part of our mission, but it's also not particularly negative in any way. It's pretty neutral. And the money that's generated from that lease funds our music director for Sunday. So we're able to generate some revenue over here in box 4 to pay for the activities back here in box 1. This section of the map is where, unfortunately, we often end up, whether we choose to or not. And these are activities that we probably shouldn't be doing for various reasons. So Things in boxes 5, 6, 7 are sort of they're activities that don't have any purpose at all or neutral, but they cost us money. An example, sometimes I've seen in churches, or at least we had a press house, is we actually rented space in our church to outside organizations when we had an open space. Nothing wrong with that. That's actually great in many ways, except we found when we actually analyzed the financial impact and the mission impact that these were organizations sometimes that had no alignment with our mission. They weren't serving any purpose in our setting. They weren't serving students the way we wanted to serve them. And in fact, when we look closely at the financial implications, it was costing us money, more money to rent the space out than they were paying us. So by the time we added up utility fees and custodial and administrative management and all of that, it turned out that I was raising money from donors to subsidize the renting out of space to an organization that served no real purpose to our mission. So we had had to eliminate some of those relationships, and those were sort of in box 7. Box 9 are kind of the things that Eve was talking about, especially with relation to investment. So if I'm Greenpeace and I'm seeking to be focused on the environment, and most of my money is invested in fracking or in some sort of other environmental degradation, there's a real disconnect, like a negative impact with what's happening. So I might be generating a whole lot of money over here from a fracking business and then spending it on trying to change the fracking business. And there's a point at which that discrepancy is just not reconcilable and really needs to stop. Unfortunately, we do find ourselves there. I mean, it's maybe a provocative statement, but I actually wonder whether some of the investments that churches are heavily in, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Google, that's where most church money ends up being located, a lot of it at least. I think we have to start asking these questions. Is Facebook a positive in our world or not? Is Amazon a positive enough in our world to be invested in it or not? Some of what was supposedly clean investments in these technology companies are beginning to be questionable, or at least we need to evaluate them. So I'll leave that for some food for thought and discussion at another time. But the last set of boxes are things that are the places that we'd love to move into, and this is where social enterprise or social business projects like Press House Apartments really show up, right? So in the Press House Apartments, as we do a good job serving students living with us, we generate both a positive impact in their lives, and we also generate revenue because they pay for those services in the form of rent, in the form of living there. The better we do with our mission, the more money we generate, and the two rise together in a very unified way. Now, you have to be very thoughtful throughout the whole process of all the different dynamics going on there. But social enterprise activity can fall in these boxes where you're either at least breaking even or actually generating money while at the same time fulfilling your mission. So this tool is a way of you can literally sit down and plot on here, what is the net financial impact of all of your activities and what is the mission impact of all of your activities. And we're in the process of building an assessment that will actually help people literally plot using a questionnaire and an online tool to plot all of your activities and come out with some recommendations. But this helps, I think, provide a framework for thinking about some of this.
Thank you so much. We are rapidly running out of time, and if we don't bring this to an end, we're not going to be able to have the opportunity to have some engagement from the people who have been listening to this beforehand. But I want to throw one more question for just a minute or two, and it's not a question that you can answer in a minute or two. And Mark, I want to warn you, this is a very Anglican question because it's a both and maybe a little messy. So even are more comfortable with this than you Presbyterians are with your order. But where do we start? Do we start with the individual personal finances? Where do we start this journey? With the personal finances or with our congregation's finances?
I
Where do we
would
start?
agree with the both and, because I think it is salt and light. I think the thing is that the big institutional maneuvers that you can make as a corporate investor, as a person raising a building that is a public witness in the way that Mark's congregation have been doing, that's the light on the hill. And you've got to do some very deliberate role modeling to show how you're voting your cash. But individually, shoving a few grains of salt into your stew, that's what we can all do. So for me, it is both and, because it is salt and light.
Salt and light.
I like that. Yes, I absolutely would agree. I mean, we're all connected in some way with investment and with these decisions, both in our own personal lives and almost always through some other method that we're connected with, through some sort of a investment fund or a pension fund or a 401k or whatnot. And so make those the saying one or the other is impossible, right? It's always got to be both. And I think, in a way, all of this work in the church is not just about moving dollars. It's not just about a bank balance statements. It's about transformation and discipleship. And so, having that conversation inform and change our lives on a deep level is really what it's all about, and is important.
Well, thank you both for this conversation. My passion at Faith and Finance is trying to help the church do what Eve talks about in that sentence I was using earlier, and that is we've got to get better at showing the way and being willing to step up and talk about money. And both of the work that both of you are doing is such a great guide for us, and you're showing us the way. So thank you for that, and we will be talking again soon, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Rosalie, there's a lot there in that conversation, wide-ranging, everything from personal finance all the way to institutional economics. I wonder, a day on, what do you hear in that conversation that you would lift up to us as sort of a grace note at the end of our time?
Well, in some ways it's a day on, and in some ways it's kind of a year on, having been in conversation with these folks and people like them for quite a while now. The hope that is in those conversations, that we are not finding that churches are not just captive to an economy, to a neoliberal understanding of what the world is about, that churches are able to make different decisions. And Eve's thing about salt and light, and how I see Mark's work and Eve's work as that salt and light to show us the way. And you told me earlier that shameless plugs are okay. It's one of the things we're trying to do at Faith and Finance, is find more and more and more of these stories. And I'm seeing in the text thread people talking about what they're doing with their endowments and how people are making changes. And every time one of us makes a decision to be more salt in the world, to put more salt in the stew, is a vote for God's economy. And the thing I would encourage all of you on this is to start really understanding that there is no bifurcating of the economy and the gospel. That if you're believing that, and I believe it, I believe that the economy is this thing that has control of me. I know that that's how I was raised. That's in my DNA, to believe that there's not much I can do about it, that I just have to live with it. But that, you've heard it said, but I say to you, that is not what we need to be believing. We need to be understanding that as people who follow Jesus, that we get to make different choices. And it's pretty important right now, particularly when you look at the issues of racial disparity and wealth disparity, that if the church does not take that lead that Eve talks about in her book, if we don't stand up for this, it's not going to change. And we really have to do it. And we have great leaders. We have great folks to follow. Mark Elston and Eve Poole being two among them.
So the resources you heard referenced in that conversation, we're going to actually upload those into the Whova app so that it won't disappear with the chat box. We will also save the chat box so that people can access that later. Rosalie, one of the things that I really appreciate about this conversation is the long view. And the sense that church budgets are moral documents, they're missional documents, and that these tools that Mark and Eve introduced us to work at the congregational level, they work individually, they help us to actually sort of say, if the aim isn't to just make budget, if the aim is actually this, I loved, we can transform the market even. That to me was a real note of hope.
Yes, I've seen that happen. In 2008, we started Social Capital Markets, SoCap, which was looking at impact investing. And over the however many years that's been, 14 years that it's been, 3,000 people come every year to talk about how to look at their investment portfolio differently. And social entrepreneurs come looking for investment. When we started it, my personal financial manager person, whatever he is, came to it and said, kind of looked at me and said, well, this is kind of cute. You know, this is sweet, what y'all are trying to do here. And 5 years later, every one of his, he reported every one of his clients was asking him, how do we check to make sure that our investments are going into things that make a difference in the world? Wall Street values it now. B corporations are, for benefit corporations are a thing. Corporations are looking at their corporate responsibility to their shareholders, but they're also looking at their responsibility to the world. And the church needs to jump right in there with that. And we can change, the church can change the world. And the church can change the world by talking clearly about proper use of money and our proper relationship with money. And our parishioners want us to. I know that. We were talking about David King. You mentioned David King earlier. David and I've had conversations where we know that if you talk about money broadly, not just during stewardship time, but if you talk about personal finance, if you talk about your congregational's budget being a moral document, if you do that exploration that Mark was talking about, using the 9 Square tool to, you know, where is our money coming from and how are we using it? If you have those conversations in the open, people begin to trust you with their money. They begin to see, I believe they see that we have a value in their lives in a practical way, and that the church is meaningful and more than just arriving on Sunday morning for a worship service. And I think it's all goes hand in hand, and really hope people will start talking about it more.
One way we can do that is to carry this conversation over to Whova. Rosalie, I know you're there, I'm there. We look forward to continuing the conversation there. You'll see our contact information. But thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation about future economic models and how the church engages in economic practices. James Harlan, back to you for a benediction.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalie. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Jesse, in the control room for making this all work. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Please take a moment to fill out an evaluation when you get a chance. That's really helpful in planning next year's conference and where we go with this. And so go in peace to love and serve the Lord, and we'll see you soon. God bless.
Thanks be to God.